A secret told in a whisper, a debt paid in full, and a life changed forever. Every video we post is a brand new mystery waiting for you to unravel its deepest layers. Subscribe today to unlock the truth that stays hidden from others.
The first time I heard him call her sweetheart, it was 6:17 on a Tuesday morning, and I was standing in the hallway outside his home office holding a mug of coffee I'd made exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. The mug was warm in my hands. His voice carried through the door, low and amused, the way it used to sound with me when we were still something worth saving. I didn't open the door. I didn't drop the mug. I just turned around, walked back to the kitchen, and poured the coffee down the drain. Then I rinsed the mug, set it upside down on the rack, and thought, very calmly, so that's how it is. My name is Delphine. I'm 41 years old, and for 17 years I was the wife of a man named Augustus Whitlock, founder and CEO of Whitlock Capital Partners, a hedge fund headquartered in a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan. We lived in a townhouse on the Upper East Side, the kind with a limestone facade and a wrought iron gate. The kind that gets photographed by tourists who don't know anyone lives there. I had a closet the size of my childhood bedroom. I had a housekeeper named Rosario who had been with us for 12 years. I had everything a woman was supposed to want. I also had a husband who had started calling another woman sweetheart at 6 in the morning. That evening, my husband came home at the usual hour, kissed me on the forehead the way you'd kiss an elderly aunt, and told me we were having dinner at Le Bernardin with a new client and his associate. He said the associate's name was Camille Reeves. He said she was sharp. He said I'd like her. He said all of this without looking at me, while untying his tie in front of the mirror in our bedroom, and I stood in the doorway and watched his reflection and understood that my husband was about to introduce me to his mistress. I wore a navy silk dress and my grandmother's pearls. I blow-dried my hair myself because I didn't want Rosario to see my hands shaking. In the car on the way to the restaurant, my husband scrolled through his phone and made a single comment about the traffic on Park Avenue. When we arrived, the maître d' greeted him by name, and we were led to a corner table where a man in his 60s stood to shake hands. His name was Gerald Ashford. Next to him sat a woman in her late 20s with chestnut hair and a cream-colored blouse and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Delphine, my husband said, placing his hand on the small of my back with the performative tenderness of a man who was very good at performing. This is Camille. She extended her hand. Her nails were manicured the color of ballet slippers. Mrs. Whitlock, I've heard so much. I took her hand. I smiled. I said, have you? He hasn't told me anything about you at all. My husband laughed a little too quickly and pulled out my chair. The evening proceeded. Gerald Ashford spoke about his divestment plans. My husband ordered the tasting menu for the table without asking. Camille laughed at everything my husband said, and twice she touched his wrist with 2 fingers, casually, the way a woman touches a man whose body she already knows. At one point she leaned toward me over her wineglass and said, your husband talks about you like you're very delicate, Mrs. Whitlock. It's so sweet. I looked at her for a long moment. I took a sip of my wine. I said, he underestimates a lot of things. She blinked. My husband cleared his throat and changed the subject. When we got home that night, he followed me into the bedroom and shut the door. His face had gone cold, the way it did when something hadn't gone the way he'd scripted it. He said I'd embarrassed him. He said I'd been rude to a colleague. He said I had no idea what kind of pressure he was under, and that the least I could do, after everything he'd given me, was smile and be gracious. I said, she touched your wrist twice. He said, don't be hysterical. I said, nothing. He said, you know what, Delphine? Until you can learn to act like a grown woman instead of a jealous teenager, you can sleep in the guest room. Think about what you've done. I looked at him, at the man I had loved once, at the man whose cufflinks I had chosen, and whose ties I had knotted and whose parents I had buried beside him, and I said very quietly, okay. He wasn't expecting that. He wanted a fight. He wanted tears. He wanted me to apologize so he could forgive me and feel magnanimous about it. When I just turned, picked up my robe from the chair and walked down the hall to the guest room, he stood in the bedroom doorway for a full minute before I heard him close the door. I didn't cry that night. I sat on the edge of the guest bed in the dark, and I thought about Camille's fingers on his wrist, and I thought about the coffee I'd poured down the drain that morning, And I thought about a conversation I'd had 3 weeks earlier with a woman named Harriet Ashford, Gerald's wife, at a charity gala. Harriet was 63 years old, with silver hair cut sharply at her jaw. She had cornered me by the coat check and said very softly, "Your husband's firm has been using my husband's name on things he hasn't signed. If you ever want to talk, here's my card." I had thanked her politely and tucked the card into my clutch and thought nothing more of it. Now, in the dark of the guest room, I took my phone off the nightstand and sent Harriet Ashford a text. "I'd like to talk, tomorrow if possible." She replied in under a minute. "Come to the Carlisle at 10, I'll be in the lounge." The next morning at 6:45, my husband came into the guest room without knocking. I was already awake, sitting up in bed with my reading glasses on, pretending to read a novel. He stood in the doorway in his running clothes and looked at me with the patient, slightly bored expression of a man waiting for a child to apologize. "Well," he said, "have you learned your lesson?" I looked up from my book. I said, "I think so." He nodded. He said, "Good girl." Something in me went very still. I felt the same stillness I had felt the first time I watched a hawk take a sparrow out of the air in Central Park. A kind of cold clarity that came from understanding that the world was not what I had been told it was. I closed my book. I smiled at him. I said, "I'll have breakfast ready at 8. He said, "That's my girl," and left to go meet his trainer at the gym. The moment the front door closed behind him, I got out of bed and walked barefoot down the hall to his office. I didn't rush. I knew where the spare key to his filing cabinet was. He kept it in the same place he'd kept it for 15 years, taped to the underside of the third drawer of his desk. I sat down in his leather chair, opened the cabinet, and began to read. I read for 40 minutes. I photographed everything. Bank statements with monthly transfers to a company called Meridian Consulting that didn't appear anywhere on his firm's official records. Hotel receipts from the St. Regis in Washington, D.C., for dates when he'd told me he was in London. A lease agreement for an apartment on West 79th Street in a name I didn't recognize. A prenup addendum, signed only by him, that attempted to alter the terms of our original agreement in ways that would have been laughable if they weren't so insulting. I photographed it all, closed the cabinet, returned the key, and was back in the kitchen scrambling eggs by the time Rosario came in to start the laundry. At 10 o'clock I met Harriet Ashford in the lounge of the Carlisle. She was wearing a gray cashmere sweater and reading the Wall Street Journal. She folded it when she saw me and gestured to the seat across from her. "How much do you know?" she asked. "Enough to listen," I said. She talked for an hour. She told me things about my husband's firm that my husband had never told me. She told me that Gerald had been trying to untangle himself from Whitlock Capital for 2 years. She told me that Camille Reeves was not an associate at Gerald's firm. She told me that Camille Reeves was, in fact, on the payroll of Meridian Consulting, the same shell company I had found listed in my husband's files that morning. She told me the name of a divorce attorney in Midtown. Her name was Priya Ramanathan. Harriet said, "Tell her I sent you. She'll see you today." I saw Priya Ramanathan at 2 o'clock that afternoon in a conference room on the 34th floor of a building on 6th Avenue. She was in her late 40s, with a plain dark suit and the kind of eyes that missed nothing. I showed her what I had photographed. She looked at the photos for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Mrs. Whitlock, your husband has been very careless. How would you like to proceed?" I said, quietly and completely. She said, "Good, that's exactly how we'll do it." For the next 6 weeks I lived 2 lives. In one, I was Delphine Whitlock, the chastened wife, sleeping in the guest room, making my husband's breakfast, laughing at the right moments during the dinner parties he insisted I still attend. In the other, I was a woman building an exit. Priya had me open a new checking account at a small bank in Brooklyn where my husband had no connections. Harriet introduced me to a forensic accountant named Beatrice Holloway, a woman in her 50s who had once been an investigator for the SEC and now did consulting work out of a quiet office in Hoboken. Beatrice taught me what to look for and how to look for it without being caught. My housekeeper Rosario, who had watched my husband belittle me for 12 years, began leaving me small pieces of information she'd noticed without being asked. A hotel key card she'd found in his suit jacket pocket. A receipt from a jewelry store on Madison Avenue for a bracelet I had never received. I learned that my husband kept a second phone. I learned where he kept it. I learned his password, which was the birthday of his first dog. Because men like my husband think they are more complicated than they are. One afternoon in the third week, I was sitting in Priya's office and she slid a folder across the table and said, "There's something you need to see." Inside were documents showing that my husband had, 6 months earlier, attempted to transfer ownership of our townhouse, which had been purchased with commingled funds, into an LLC he controlled alone. The attempt had failed on a technicality. He had not told me about it. Priya looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "He was preparing to leave you. He just hadn't decided when." I did not cry. I felt the last small tender thing in me go quiet, and I said, "Then we move faster." In the 5th week, Harriet invited me to lunch. We sat at a small table at Via Quadrono on 73rd Street, and she ate a panini and watched me with something that might have been affection. She said, "You're going to be fine, you know. I was 30 years younger than you are when I figured out what Gerald was. I spent the next 3 decades pretending I hadn't. Don't do what I did." I said, "Why are you helping me, Harriet?" She said, "Because someone should have helped me and no one did. And because your husband is going to try to break you on his way out, and I want him to find out there's nothing left to break." I reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time in 6 weeks I had touched another person without performing anything. The plan came together on a Tuesday. My husband had a breakfast meeting at 7, then a flight to Chicago at 11, returning Friday evening. Priya filed the divorce petition at 9:15. Beatrice had already secured copies of every relevant financial document. A moving company Priya worked with regularly had been scheduled for 10 o'clock. The doorman of our building, a man named Clement who had been working our block for 30 years and whom my husband had never once learned the name of, had agreed to let the movers in through the service entrance and to note the time and contents of every box that left. He did this, he told me quietly, because my husband had once screamed at him for holding the elevator for a delivery man when my husband was in a hurry, and Clement had been waiting 7 years to do something about it. I packed for 3 days and took only what was mine: my clothes, my grandmother's pearls and her silver, and the small watercolor of the Maine coast that had hung in my grandmother's kitchen, and that my husband had once suggested I put in a closet because it didn't match the decor. I took the first editions my father had given me on my 18th birthday. I took my own tax records and my passport and the jewelry that had been given to me, not by my husband, but by people who actually loved me. I did not take the bracelet from the Madison Avenue jeweler, because it had never been given to me, but I photographed the receipt Rosario had found, and I gave the photograph to Priya, because a man who buys his mistress jewelry on a joint credit card is a man whose assets become a great deal more interesting to a divorce court. By noon the townhouse was half empty on my side and untouched on his. I left a single sheet of paper on the kitchen island. It was the cover page of the divorce petition, with the case number and Priya's contact information. I did not leave a note. There was nothing left to say that a judge could not say better. Then I went to the Lowell Hotel, where Priya had booked me a suite, and I sat by the window with a cup of tea and I waited. He called me at 6:42 that evening. I had been expecting the call at some point between 6 and 7, depending on how the flight went and how long it took him to walk into the house and notice. He had noticed faster than I had predicted. His voice was the voice I had not heard in years, the voice from before the firm, from before the Upper East Side, from before he had learned that he could get what he wanted by being cold. It was the voice of a man who was afraid. "Delphine," he said, "what is this?" I said, "It's exactly what it looks like." He said, "We can talk about this." I said, "We can talk about this through our attorneys." He said, "Delphine, please, don't do this. I know I know things have been hard, and I was wrong about the guest room thing. I was out of line. I'll sleep there for a month if you want." I said, "Augustus." He stopped. I said, "You bought her a bracelet at Buccellati on our joint credit card on March 14th. You transferred $84,000 to Meridian Consulting in the last 8 months. You tried to put the townhouse in an LLC in September. I have photographs of all of it. Please stop talking." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing. I could hear, somewhere in the background, the sound of a woman's voice asking a question. I don't know if it was Camille or Rosario or someone else, and I found with a small clean surprise that I did not care. He said, "Who helped you?" I said, "Women you never bother to learn the names of." I hung up. The mediation took 11 weeks. It would have taken less, But my husband hired 3 different lawyers in sequence, each more expensive than the last, each telling him the same thing, which was that he had been sloppy and that his wife was not sloppy and that he should settle. In the final session, we sat across from each other at a long walnut table in a conference room with a view of the Hudson. He looked older than he had looked 11 weeks earlier. His suit didn't fit him quite the same way. When the mediator read out the terms, I watched my husband's face. The townhouse was sold. I took 60% of the proceeds, reflecting the commingled funds and the attempted LLC transfer. The wine collection, which I had never particularly cared about, went to me, because Priya had explained that the wine collection was worth $400,000 and that my husband loved it more than he loved almost anything else. The art went to me. The house in Sag Harbor went to me. A lump sum in lieu of alimony, which I had insisted on because I did not want to be attached to him by any thread, and one small thing, which I had asked for and which Priya had arranged with a smile, which was the return of my grandmother's writing desk, the one my husband had claimed for his office years ago and refused to give back during an argument I had long since stopped having. When the signatures were done, my husband looked at me across the table and said, "Was it worth it, Delphine?" I said it wasn't about worth. It was about witness. He didn't understand. I hadn't expected him to. I walked out of the building onto 6th Avenue, and the afternoon light was sharp and gold, and the city smelled like cold stone and roasted nuts, and Harriet Ashford was waiting for me at the corner with 2 cups of coffee. She handed me one and said, "How do you feel?" I said, "I feel like I can breathe." She said, "That's how it starts." I moved into a small apartment on the Upper West Side, 3 blocks from the park. It had a bay window and a fireplace that actually worked, and a kitchen that fit exactly 1 person comfortably, which was the right number. Rosario, whom I had helped place with a family in Brooklyn who paid her properly and called her by her full name, came for lunch on Sundays. Harriet and I had dinner every other week at a little Italian place on Amsterdam. Priya sent me a holiday card the 1st December with a note that read, "You were the easiest hard case I ever had." I bought myself flowers on Fridays, which was something my mother had always done and which I had forgotten I loved. I took a class at the Art Students League, because when I was 19 I had wanted to paint, and had been told by a man I was dating that painting was a hobby and not a future. I went to Maine alone in August and stayed in the cottage by the water for 2 weeks, and I hung my grandmother's watercolor over the small desk in the bedroom, and I wrote in a journal every morning. And I learned that the person I had been afraid of being alone with was, in fact, a person I quite liked. I saw Camille once, a year after the divorce. I was coming out of a bookstore on Broadway and she was getting into a taxi. And for a moment our eyes met. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had learned something she hadn't expected to learn. I thought about walking over. I thought about saying something. And then I thought about what Harriet had said to me that day at the Carlisle, about how someone should have helped her and no one did, and I crossed the street and went up to Camille before the taxi pulled away. I said, "Are you all right?" She stared at me. I think she expected me to slap her. I said, "I know what he's like. I know how he makes you feel. If you need someone to talk to, I know a lawyer." I handed her Priya's card, which I had been carrying in my wallet for no particular reason. Or maybe for exactly this reason. She took it without speaking. I walked away and did not look back. 6 months later, Priya called to tell me that Camille had come to see her. I put down the phone, and I stood in my little kitchen with the late afternoon light coming through the window, and I thought about all the women who had helped me, and all the women who had helped them, and all the women who had helped them, and all the women who were, right now, somewhere in a guest room in the dark, deciding that they had learned their lesson, but not the one their husband had in mind. I poured myself a glass of the wine that had once belonged to a man who had called another woman sweetheart at 6 in the morning. I raised it, quietly, to no one in particular, and I drank.